underlying assumptions that we have about decision making is much needed in policy circles.
Welcome to Split Decision, the Decision Science podcast, where we discuss the latest insights from decision science with experts working in research and practice. I'm Alan Sanfy, and today we sit down with Esther-Mirjam Sent, Professor of Economic Theory and Economic Policy at Radboud University, Nijmegen. In addition to her academic role, Esther-Mirjam is also actively involved in policymaking. She's been a member of the Dutch Senate since 2011, and since her election in October 2021 is currently the chairperson of the Dutch Labour Party. In this episode, we discuss the worlds of science, policy, and the interaction between the two in practice. We hear her thoughts on the role of scientists in shaping policies that impact us all, the responsibilities of politicians in using scientific evidence, and what she wishes every policymaker knew about how people really make their decisions. To learn more about Esther-Mirjam, follow her on Twitter at @emsent. Well, thank you, Esther-Mirjam, for joining us on the podcast. We're delighted to have you and looking forward to a chat about decision-making, economics, politics, policy, and the intersection of all four. Maybe to start, I'm curious how you decided to do what you do. So what made you want to be an economist, and how did that path unfold for you?
I wanted to improve the world as a young girl, and of course, I had no idea what improvement meant. And I felt that I should go into politics to do so. And then I figured that economics would provide a solid basis for offering policy recommendations. Regrettably, at that time, economics had little to do with the real world. And I wondered, where do these economists get their authority? What is going on here? And that's how I forgot about my initial wishes for a while and started doing history and philosophy of economics to understand the position of economics. And then subsequently, to cut this story short, in the end, of course, economics is changing. It's moving in the direction of behavioral science, cognitive science. So now I find economics a good tool to help in policy making, and policy making needs it because it's still reliant on these old, outdated ideas. So it's all coming together now, first as my position as a senator, and now my position as party chairperson.
Okay, so economics was initially a means to an end, but then you decided that you wanted to try and change economics after seeing the tradition of it. So what do you find kind of most compelling about economics in terms of as a lever to enact public good? Is it that it's the most convenient tool because economists have this authority, or do you think there's something inherently useful about it when trying to implement positive policies?
I think economics in relation to other sciences is strongest. For the longest time, economists did not want to have those relations. They pretended to be the hardest of the social sciences. They had rigorous models. These models shaped policy, but policy was designed almost solely for gross domestic product and reliant on Homo economicus, who makes rational decisions. Fortunately, economics is moving away from gross domestic product as a goal, looking at gross national happiness or broader senses of well-being. Fortunately, economics is moving away from Homo economicus. So I think with this change in economics, embedding it in a broader array of sciences, offering a rich perspective on what the goals of policy are, and offering a rich perspective on the underlying assumptions that we have about decision making is much needed in policy circles.
Okay, so just to think about Homo economicus for a second. So this is obviously the characterized and sometimes caricatured idea from economics that we're rational decision makers. We have time and energy and attention to carefully survey all our choices and pick the most rational, and we'll respond appropriately to incentives and so on. And so from a psychological perspective, where I sit, I wonder sometimes, is this still the current mainstream view in economics? So you mentioned it is changing, and certainly people like yourself, who I would say are more on the cutting edge, have, I think, abandoned this rather strict and possibly not very accurate view. But how do you think kind of mainstream economics is, both in the Netherlands and worldwide? Is this still the canonical view of human behavior?
Mainstream economics is pluralistic. It's about behavioral economics, happiness economics, neuroeconomics, environmental economics, and so on and so forth. So it has a really rich landscape, taking inspiration from psychology, taking inspiration from sociology, from biology. Regrettably, this rich perspective from economics has not completely made its way into policy circles yet. And that's because Homo economicus is great. Homo economicus is predictable. Homo economicus responds to financial incentives. And that's what policymakers struggle with. They want to know, if I have a certain proposal, how are people going to respond to it? And if people are going to respond to it in many different ways, then that could lead to more insecurity in policy outcomes. So that's why it's still quite prevalent, but also in policy circles, fortunately, it's changing.
And it's changing through, I mean, how are the ways it's changing? Is it through kind of economists who have different models? Is it through an opening to other types of behavioral science, or what's the main way we could try and persuade these older models or older modelers that there's better ways of thinking about decision making?
It's changing because of the institutional landscape in the Netherlands changing. So it used to be that the Netherlands Bureau for Economic Policy Analysis was dominant, but now we have two other institutions that are important in policy evaluations and recommendations: the Planning Bureau for the Environment and the Social and Cultural Planning Bureau. So that is changing. What is changing is that there is a group at the ministries, the Behavioral Insights Network Netherlands, and these are scientists or people that are typically trained in the behavioral sciences, and that see opportunities for new ways of designing policies. So I think, as in teaching, we always teach what we were taught, or we're always lagging behind in bringing the research frontier in teaching. The same thing is happening in policy. There's a lag in bringing the research frontier into policy. I think perhaps the credit crisis had something to do with it. And the credit crisis made it obvious that people are not rational, that they're boundedly rational, that there are all kinds of biases that play a role. So I think that really brought the behavioral perspective to the forefront, and in line with all those developments, fortunately, there is a change. And well, one of the things that's potentially interesting about the behavioral sciences is it could be cheap to change behavior with all kinds of recommendations coming from the behavioral sciences. In economics, it's always you have to incentivize people, you have to give them subsidies, and then they will behave in the way that you wish. But fortunately, with the behavioral insights, there is a much bigger set of tools, and potentially a set of tools that is not as expensive as the financial incentives that economists recommend.
And I guess that's a persuasive argument for government and policy. If it's better and cheaper, that's probably a good thing to do. Do you feel that this kind of development, this input of behavioral science, is that inevitable? Is that, you mentioned the lag, is that just going to happen by itself, or is there still work to be done by people like you to persuade or twist arms in these government institutions to still demonstrate the utility of bringing in these other approaches?
I think there's much work still to be done. And I'm glad that at Radboud University, we're joining forces in the Radboud Center for Decision Science to bring this to the forefront, because it's so, what is the word? It's just so tempting to see gross domestic product as the goal. It's so tempting because it's easy to calculate. And homo economics is so tempting because homo economics reacts in predictable manners. Sometimes it has been said that it's the bounded rationality of policymakers that makes them so excited to model agents as being rational. It's to kind of cover their own bounded rationality.
Yeah.
So it's so strong, this thinking in terms of rationality, this thinking in terms of gross domestic product as the goal, the dominance of the Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy Research is changing, but it's still tempting to get these nice calculations, because then we can say, oh, the government is wrong because in 2050 we're going to have a national debt of 95% or whatever. That's people like those kinds of predictions. They like those kinds of numbers. Policymakers don't trust each other, and they try to hang on to the security that old economics is at least pretending to have. And some are still convinced, but fortunately more and more are not. But just because it's so ingrained and tempting and easy, there's much work to be done.
Yeah, well, I think that's also one of the lures of the kind of quantitative approach. But that's also, I think, one of the very positive things about what economics, the way it tries to approach things, is with trying to be formal and quantitative. And hopefully some of that will also bleed over to the behavioral sciences, which I think have been rightly criticized as being perhaps maybe more accurate in the aggregate, but somewhat fuzzy in trying to actually enact policy and trying to predict what people are actually going to do. So some useful merging of the two seems the way forward. Do you have any sense, Esther-Mirjam, whether the experience of the Netherlands, is that representative more broadly around the world in terms of kind of government policy decision-making, or are we special here in the lowlands?
I don't think so. In the UK, they were much quicker with the behavioral insights team offering insights. President Obama had a team of experts coming up with recommendations. So I don't think it's unusual. I don't think we're on our own in the Netherlands in these developments. It could be that in the Netherlands, there's also an extra impetus now because of the scandal around the subsidies for childcare, because we have arranged our system in such a way that it's very equitable, or it's eerlijk en rechtvaardig, but it's so complex. And we didn't see this complexity because we felt that people would be making rational decisions, that you would know every time your income changes, you're going to tell the government and your subsidy is going to change. So I think this whole situation about the childcare subsidies and the scandals, the errors that were being made are going to prove to be an extra impetus for taking the image we have of human decision-making seriously.
Okay, so the idea that every crisis is also an opportunity, that it's a way to demonstrate the fallibility of the older models. So from a practical perspective, as scientists, how then do we actually do this? So if we have ideas about how people we think actually make decisions, and we understand that, of course, people are not going to report to the government every time their income changes because people are busy and doesn't seem very important. And we have all these cognitive limitations. So how then would usefully scientists proceed to try and help? Because that, I think, is often a barrier for individual scientists, that they don't know who to talk to, or who am I going to inform of my latest findings. So do you have any recommendations there, or at least a bigger sense of the landscape as to how that would work?
Yeah, we have a great landscape in the Netherlands of scientists coming up with recommendations. We have the Scientific Council, or de Wetenschappelijke Raad voor het Regeringsbeleid. It's the Council of Scientists coming up with recommendations, and they published a very influential study it's called Weten is nog geen doen. When you know something, it doesn't mean that you necessarily act upon it. And it has been really, really influential in policy circles. So if you're a scientist, if you wish to have an impact, you could either think of connecting with institutions that presently put this on the agenda, and this Council of Scientists is an illustration of this. The Behavioral Insights Network at the ministries is an illustration of it. You could offer to give a presentation. They also have something called the Dag van het Gedrag, the Day of Behavior, where all kinds of scientists present themselves and come up with policy recommendations, and where there are roundtables, discussions between policymakers and scientists. And don't underestimate the power of a public opinion being published in the newspaper. Don't underestimate the power of blogs like sociale vraagstukken, or for economists we have Me Judice, and then there's the magazine where economists publish policy recommendations, economisch-statistische berichten. So don't underestimate the readership of publications and the potential impact that this may have.
So, and I guess these are all relatively new avenues that have been opened. So hopefully they'll be active now, and scientists can take these opportunities to try and elicit positive change. I wonder, so as we mentioned, you're heavily involved in politics here in the Netherlands. You're the chairperson of the Dutch Labour Party, one of the biggest political parties. And I wonder then about the relationship between policy and politics. And if I'm a scientist, I have some great new insight. I know that defaults work, for example, and so I decide, organ donation is going to be the target of a change default, as happened here a few years ago. How does an insight like this kind of turn into policy and legislation? And what's the interaction between politics? And as a scientist who is presumably relatively neutral about the politics, do I need to think about the political landscape when trying to enact my insights?
There are avenues directly going to political parties, and there are avenues going to policy in general. Political parties have scientific bureaus that conduct research and that influence the thinking within the political parties. But then there are often expert panels held in the second chamber. And also when I was a member in the Senate, we had expert panels. And the organ donation is a really nice illustration of it, because we struggled with it. It seems to be a natural candidate for setting the default properly, but then there are also concerns about ethics, concerns about, what are the moral limits? Is this within it or without, inside the limits or outside of the limits? So while we were struggling, we had expert meetings. We asked scientists to come over and to come up with recommendations. Recently, I was a spokesperson for a law on vaccination. And then I just knew that some scientists had published about this. I contacted them, I asked them for recommendations. They felt inspired to write an article themselves, send it to all the senators. It's not hard to get through to the senators, especially not the senators, but it's also not hard to get through to the other political parties in parliament with your insights.
Would you recommend that scientists think about the political implications, or should they remain neutral? So I wonder, if I come up with this idea for defaults for organ donation, should I just be presenting, well, if you want to raise the organ donation rate, this is one way to do it. And then it's the political party's job to figure out the ethics. And of course, different political parties have different, perhaps moral views on whether this is coercion or not. So what's the scientist's role there, in your opinion? Is it really just to present, if you want decisions to change, you do X, or is it to also take into account these other factors?
Well, sometimes it's just in the nature of scientists to not be able to take all these other factors into consideration. And that's why it's nice that scientists are joined together in centers like the Radboud Center for Decision Science, so that you can bring these various perspectives together. So I think it's quite a burden to put on the shoulders of one scientist to offer the entire perspective of ideas and insights when it comes to organ donation. And that's why, in the Senate, we would never ask one person. We always asked, and we knew one person knows a lot about individual decision making, one person is a philosopher, one person is quantitative, one person is more qualitatively oriented. I think that's exchange of ideas can happen in politics.
Yeah, and I think it's probably, well, I think it's, so you think it's then the job of the kind of the political infrastructure to kind of put those different opinions together and derive a policy from it. Because I'm often struck in the Netherlands over the past couple of years with the recommendations that come from the outbreak management team here, often have a very clear focus, which is we want to reduce the numbers in the intensive care units is typically their goal, and their policies work towards that. But of course, there's unintended consequences of these policies which have impact on other social aspects, whether it's mental health or isolation or that. So, and I think scientists sometimes could usefully be informed as to how things actually work in politics. I think that often we think, well, you want to do X, or you want to achieve X, you should just do Y, and we don't think of all of the richness of that decision potentially. So do you think there could be a role for educating scientists as to the policy political process? Because we of course know nothing about it. Would that be useful, you think, at some level?
It's useful to know as a scientist, who are the actors in policy making, what are the steps in policy making, what are the ways in which you can influence policy making. But then in the end, it's the politician who has to decide. And I think it's the responsibility of the politician to take a wide array of perspectives into consideration. I don't blame the outbreak management team. I blame politicians for not having a wider array of perspectives present in the outbreak management team. So I worry about putting too much of a burden on the shoulders of scientists. I think this is a burden that needs to be taken upon by politicians.
Yeah, well, one thing I found interesting throughout this process is often the politicians would say, well, we're following the science. And in a way, they kind of just will just default to what the outbreak management team say, because they're the scientists, and perhaps we became too led by the scientists who maybe had and that their job was to simply look at how we reduce the spread, and their job wasn't to take into account these other factors. So that could potentially be an unintended consequence of following science, is that we actually, the people who should be taking the bigger perspective isn't. But I guess we can all learn from this experience on multiple levels. I wonder about what you think the fundamental facts about decision making that policymakers should know and incorporate into their processes. Are there certain things you feel are really important that aren't contained in the standard economic model, but have been revealed over the past, 10, 20, 30 years of behavioral science that you think are particularly important, you'd like to put on a post-it note and stick on every policymaker's desk if you could?
Ooh, I think the fact that it's difficult to answer this question is perhaps also an illustration of the richness of human behavior and the difficulty of capturing that in a few highlights. I think the most important message that scientists so far have not taken seriously enough is that people are perhaps incentivized by money, but that many other considerations play a role, and that if these are used in a creative manner, a whole new toolkit opens up. So I hope that behavioral science brings creativity to policymaking, and I also hope that it brings the opportunity to experiment. Because we never quite know, which bias is going to work in which direction and is going to be dominant. There's so many uncertain factors. And I think we should have much more room for experiments in policy, small scale experiments, because so often in the Senate, we just didn't quite know what the outcome was going to be. Yeah. The parties that were in the government would say, oh, I'm confident that this indeed is going to have the effect that we're predicting now. And the parties in the opposition would say, well, no, we're really critical. We don't think it's going to have these outcomes. But it's all, underbelly. It's not, scientifically based. There's not enough basis for this. So I think there needs to be more room to have experiments, to understand the richness, to understand the uncertainty, to be aware that it always can move in one direction or the other, and to bring that to policy would really be an enrichment.
So more evidence-based policy. And how, if you could design the system, how would you do that? Would you have an entity would be charged with carrying out these, or would that be contracted out to scientists or government departments, or how do you think it will be best worked?
It couldn't be one separate entity, because it needs to be close to the individual policy departments. Right. And ideally, they would have it in their own ranks. Ideally, they would be able to do this, and it wouldn't be an afterthought. But obviously, it's important to have close ties to the latest policy insights. So perhaps some kinds of networks. What also is done sometimes is that scientists spend, say, a year at a government agency or at a government department, and then go back to science. And that way, you can bring in the latest insights, and also knowing what the concerns are in science or in policy, it can inspire you in your scientific questions and research that you're conducting. So generally, those links with science need to be tighter, but at the same time, it needs to be organized close to the ministry, because otherwise, before you know it, you fall back on what you find comfortable and what is easier.
Yeah. Huh. That's an interesting approach. I wonder, do you also think that scientists need to be encouraged to participate more? Because my feeling from inside science is that scientists are largely incentivized by their publications and their place in their field, which I think for the most part, certainly in psychology and neuroscience, doesn't really value or weigh societal impact or societal work. It's mostly, fundamental research. Do you think scientists should be encouraged by carrot or stick to participate more in these important policy questions?
I'm very enthusiastic about erkennen en waarderen, which is about appreciating a wide array of academic careers. Now, the only career that is really valued is the career in which a lot of scientific standing is achieved by means of publications in top-ranked journals. I'm not enthusiastic about the incentive structure in science and the limitations that it puts upon people to influence policymaking. But at the same time, obviously, basic research, fundamental research needs to be done. Not all research has to be applied, but there needs to be more space for a wide array of careers in science, and some will be more focused on fundamental research, and some can be more focused on bringing those fundamental insights to applied perspectives and then to policy, or engaging more creatively with what are the policy concerns and how can I come up with scientific perspectives that help address those concerns. So it's a general plea for more pluralism in scientific careers. I think that would be an enrichment of the application possibilities and also of the individual characteristics of the individual scientists. Or their
should be a broader range of possibilities.
Yes.
So and just one last question about the nature of the kind of models we build, and whether they're the homo economist model or the more behaviorally rich models, they still often presuppose a fairly standard response to a set of incentives, whether it's financial incentives or whether it's a nudge in a particular direction. And I've been in my own research, of course, I wonder a lot about the variability of responses across a population, and this could be due to age or gender or culture, or many different types of people may respond differently. My sense at the moment is that isn't really an important variable taken in. There's usually, this is a kind of people think of a particular behavioral intervention should work on all people. Is that something you think about, or how do you think about that? Is there a role for looking at how different interventions may affect different people differently?
Definitely. And that's why I think we need to experiment, because you don't know how it's going to affect different people differently. And what you get in experiments is you get unexpected results because of the population that you're working with, or unexpected things that you hadn't thought of at the start. So I think your research underscores my plea to experiment more in policy settings, because it's not only about individual behavior, it's also about the institutional setting. It's about cultural differences. So what works in the United States is not a guarantee for success in the Netherlands. So to capture this diversity, I think more experiments are much needed in policy.
Well, you will not hear any argument from me as to more experiments and more data. It seems to be really the only really reliable way of assessing how people are going to respond and how people ultimately make decisions. Thank you very much, Esther-Mirjam. We really appreciate your insights and also your work in. Listeners may not know, but Esther-Mirjam has been highly influential, I think, in bringing behavioral science into Dutch government, and has been very helpful to many of us trying to make that leap. So it's much appreciated, and hopefully, well, we're already starting to see, I think, the fruits of that, and hopefully we'll have more to come in the future. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Split Decision. To hear more episodes like this, and to stay up to date on the latest in decision-making research from the Radboud Centre for Decision Science, subscribe to our podcast, follow us on @DecisionCentre on Twitter, or visit our website at www.centerefordecisionscience.nl.